The rain was relentless that summer night, hammering the roof of the old house like 1,000 tiny fists. I stood at the kitchen window watching the world drown in silver streaks, my reflection a ghost in the glass. My name's Clara, and I'm not the one this story's about, not really. I'm just the one who saw it unfold, the one who couldn't look away when the air turned thick with sin. It was my friend Lila and her stepfather Richard, a man who wore his charm like a tailored suit, all sharp edges and quiet promises. Too quiet. Lila was 25, a woman carved from moonlight and secrets, with eyes that held you hostage and a laugh that could unravel a man's soul. She'd moved back home after a bad breakup. Her heart bruised, her pride worse. The house was her mother's, but it was Richard who filled it, his presence heavy like smoke you couldn't shake. He was 48, broad-shouldered, with a voice low and smooth, the kind that made you lean in closer than you meant to. Lila's mother, Ellen, was away that week, some conference in Chicago. That left just the two of them, Lila and Richard, rattling around in that big house, the rain sealing them in like a tomb. I was there that night, dropping off a book Lila wanted. The air was humid, clinging to my skin like a second pulse. When I stepped inside, the house felt wrong too, still too warm, like it was holding its breath. Lila greeted me at the door, her silk robe slipping off one shoulder, her hair damp from a shower. "Clara, you're soaked," she said, her voice light, but her eyes restless, darting toward the hallway. Richard was there, leaning against the kitchen counter, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his shirt unbuttoned just enough to show the shadow of his chest. He smiled at me, slow and deliberate, like he knew something I didn't. We sat in the living room, the three of us, the rain a constant drumbeat outside. Lila curled up on the couch, her bare legs tucked under her, the robe riding higher than it should. Richard sat across from her, his eyes lingering too long, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. I felt it then, the undercurrent sharp and electric, like a wire sparking in the dark. They weren't talking much, but their silence was loud, heavy with things unsaid. I should have left, but I didn't. I stayed caught in the pull of something I couldn't name. Lila laughed at something Richard said, her head tilting back, exposing the curve of her throat. His gaze followed, hungry, unblinking. "Your trouble, you know that," he said, his voice teasing but edged with something darker. She met his eyes, her lips parting just enough to let the moment hang. "Maybe I am," she said, and the air shifted, grew thicker, like the moment before a storm breaks. I shifted in my seat, my skin prickling. I wasn't supposed to see this, but I couldn't stop watching. The night wore on, and the whiskey bottle emptied. Lila's robe slipped further, and she didn't bother to fix it. Richard's voice grew softer, his words more deliberate, each one landing like a touch. "You've changed since you came back," he said, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. "Grown into yourself." Lila's smile was slow, almost dangerous. "You think so?" she asked, her voice a low hum, her eyes locked on his. I felt like an intruder, but my feet wouldn't move. The rain outside roared louder, but it couldn't drown out the pulse in my ears. Then it happened. Lila stood stretching her robe, barely clinging to her frame. She crossed the room to get another bottle, her hips swaying just enough to make you notice. Richard watched her every step, his jaw tight, his hands flexing. When she passed him, her hand brushed his shoulder, accidental, or maybe not. His fingers caught hers just for a second, and I saw it, the spark, the flare of something forbidden. She didn't pull away. She stood there, her breath shallow, her eyes searching his face. "Careful," he murmured so low I barely heard it. "You're playing with fire." She didn't answer, just let her fingers linger in his before slipping free. My heart was pounding now, my mouth dry. I knew I should say something, break the spell, but I didn't. I was trapped, a witness to something I couldn't unsee. Lila sat back down closer to him, this time her knee brushing his. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in the air, thick with want. I mumbled some excuse about the rain and stood to leave, but their eyes were on each other, not me. As I reached the door, I glanced back. Richard's hand was on her wrist, his thumb tracing slow circles. She wasn't stopping him. I stepped into the rain, the cold biting my skin, but it couldn't wash away what I'd seen. Lila, so reckless, so alive in her desire. Richard, a man who knew exactly what he was doing. And me, the fool who saw it all and did nothing. The night was young, but the sin was already old, festering in the shadows of that house. I drove home, the wipers slashing through the rain, but I couldn't shake the image of her wrist in his hand, the way her eyes burned when she looked at him. I knew it wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next time I saw Lila, it was 3 days later at a cafe downtown. The rain had stopped, but the air still felt heavy, like it was waiting for something to break. She sat across from me, her fingers wrapped around a coffee mug, her eyes distant. She looked different, sharper, like a blade honed in the dark. I wanted to ask about that night, about Richard, about the way his touch lingered on her skin, but the words stuck in my throat. She didn't bring it up either, just smiled, that half smile of hers, the one that hid more than it showed. "You okay?" I asked, my voice too careful. She shrugged, her silk scarf slipping down her shoulder, revealing a faint mark, a bruise maybe, or something else. "Just restless," she said, her voice low, like she was confessing to the coffee instead of me. "This house, it's too big sometimes, too quiet." I knew she wasn't talking about the house. She was talking about him, Richard. The way he filled every room, every silence with that slow burning intensity of his. I didn't push her. I couldn't. But I saw it in her eyes, the hunger, the guilt, the thrill of crossing a line she couldn't uncross. She leaned forward, her perfume sharp and sweet, and said, "You ever feel like you're drowning in something you can't name?" I nodded, though I didn't know what she meant. Not really. But I'd seen it that night, the way her body leaned toward his, the way her breath caught when his fingers grazed her wrist. It wasn't just desire. It was something deeper, something that clawed at you until you bled. That evening, I went back to their house. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to see if the air still crackled, if the shadows still held their secrets. Lila was in the backyard under the old oak tree, her dress clinging to her thighs in the humid dusk. Richard was there too, fixing a loose board on the fence, his shirt damp with sweat clinging to his back. The way they moved around each other was different now, careful, deliberate, like dancers who knew the steps but were afraid to trip. I stood by the glass door, watching, my pulse loud in my ears. "Lila," he called, his voice low, rough, like he'd been holding it in too long. She turned, her hair catching the last of the sunlight, and walked toward him. Too close. Her hand brushed his arm as she handed him a glass of water, and I saw it again, the spark, the heat, the way her fingers lingered just a second too long. He didn't move away. Instead, he looked at her, his eyes dark, unreadable, like a man staring at his own ruin. "You shouldn't," he said, but his voice was weak, like he was begging her to prove him wrong. She didn't answer, just tilted her head, her lips parting slightly. The air between them was alive, pulsing like the moment before a kiss. "You know you shouldn't take." I wanted to shout to break the spell, but my voice was gone, swallowed by the weight of what I was seeing. Lila stepped closer, her bare foot brushing his, her dress swaying against her hips. "What if I don't want to stop?" she whispered so soft I barely heard it. His hand twitched like he was fighting himself, but then it was on her waist, his fingers digging into the fabric, pulling her closer. The world seemed to slow the dusk, wrapping them in a haze of gold and shadow. His thumb traced the curve of her hip, slow, deliberate, like he was memorizing her. She didn't pull away. Her breath was shallow, her chest rising and falling too fast. I could see it, the want, the need, the way it consumed them both. It was wrong, so wrong, but it was alive, burning brighter than anything I'd ever seen. I turned away, my face hot, my heart racing. I shouldn't have stayed, but I did, caught in the pull of their sin. When I looked back, they were closer, her hand on his chest, his fingers tangled in their hair. The air was thick with their heat, their guilt, their hunger. "Lila," he said again, his voice a low growl like a man drowning. She didn't answer, just leaned into him, her lips brushing his jaw, so soft it was barely a touch. But it was enough to shatter the last thread of restraint. His hand slid lower, pulling her against him, and I saw the way her body melted into his, the way her eyes closed, like she was surrendering to something bigger than herself. I left, then my steps unsteady, the dusk pressing against me like a weight. I didn't want to see what came next, but I knew. I knew the way their bodies would move, the way their breaths would tangle, the way the night would swallow their secret. Lila so reckless, so alive in her desire. Richard, a man who'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. And me, the witness, the one who saw it all and did nothing. The house loomed behind me, its windows dark, its secrets darker. I drove away, but the image of them stayed, her hand on his chest, his fingers in her hair, the air between them burning with something they couldn't control. Days bled into weeks, but the air never cleared. I couldn't stop thinking about Lila and Richard, about the way their eyes locked, the way their touches lingered. I saw Lila less, but when I did, she was different, her smile sharper, her laughter too quick, like she was trying to outrun something. She didn't talk about him, not directly, but I saw it in the way she moved, the way her fingers brushed her lips when she thought no one was watching. She was drowning in him, and she didn't want to be saved. One night I went back to the house. Ellen was still gone, her absence, a ghost that haunted every room. The moon was full, casting silver light through the windows, painting the walls in shades of desire. Lila was in the kitchen, pouring wine, her dress thin enough to show the outline of her body. Richard was there too, leaning against the counter, his eyes on her like she was the only thing in the world. I stood in the doorway, invisible, my breath caught in my throat. The air was heavy, charged like the moment before lightning strikes. "You're quiet tonight," Richard said, his voice low, rough, like he was tasting every word. Lila didn't look at him, just swirled the wine in her glass, her lips curved in a smile that wasn't quite a smile. "Maybe I'm just thinking," she said, her voice soft, teasing, but edged with something dangerous. She set the glass down, her movements slow, deliberate, like she knew exactly what she was doing to him, to herself, to me standing there watching it all unravel. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, his hand brushing the counter near her hip. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice a whisper, now intimate, like a secret meant only for her. She turned, her eyes meeting his, and I saw it, the fire, the hunger, the guilt that made it burn hotter. "You know what," she said, her voice barely audible, her breath catching as his fingers grazed her arm. The touch was light, but it was everything electric forbidden alive with want. I should have left. I should have turned away, but I was rooted, trapped by the weight of their desire. Lila leaned into him, her body swaying like a flame drawn to the dark. His hand slid to her waist, his fingers splaying across her back, pulling her closer, until there was no space left between them. Her breath hitched, her lips parting, and I saw the way her body responded, the way her hands gripped his shirt like she was holding on for dear life. "This is wrong," she whispered, but her voice was weak, her eyes betraying her. "Is it?" he murmured, his lips brushing her ear, his voice a low growl that sent a shiver down my spine. He didn't wait for an answer, just tilted her chin up, his thumb tracing her jaw. Their faces were inches apart, the air between them crackling with heat. She didn't pull away. She leaned in, her lips brushing his soft at first, then harder, hungrier, like they were starving for each other. The kiss was a storm, a collision of want and guilt, and I couldn't look away. His hands moved, sliding down her sides, gripping her hips, pulling her against him. Her dress rode up, exposing the curve of her thigh, the moonlight catching the sheen of her skin. She gasped, her fingers digging into his shoulders, her body arching into his. It was raw, desperate, a dance of desire that left no room for reason. I felt the heat of it, the shame of it, the thrill of it like a pulse in my own veins. They were lost in each other, consumed by the fire they'd lit, and I was the witness, the one who saw it all and did nothing. The kitchen was a haze of shadows and moonlight, their bodies tangled in a rhythm that was both beautiful and wrong. Her breath was ragged, her hands clutching at him, her eyes closed as if she could block out the guilt. His touch was relentless, his fingers tracing every curve, every line like he was claiming her. "Lila," he whispered, his voice thick with need, and she answered with a moan, soft and broken, like she was surrendering to the inevitable. I turned away, my heart pounding, my skin hot. I slipped out of the house, the moonlight cold on my face, the night swallowing me whole. I didn't want to see what came next, but I knew. I knew the way their bodies would move, the way their breaths would tangle, the way the night would burn with their sin. Lila, so reckless, so alive in her desire. Richard, a man who'd taken what wasn't his. And me, the fool who saw it all and let it happen. The house stood silent behind me, its secrets locked inside its shadows darker than the night. The weeks that followed were a blur of whispers and glances, each one heavier than the last. Lila didn't talk about it, but she didn't have to. It was written all over her, in the way her eyes lingered on the empty spaces where Richard had been, in the way her fingers trembled when she poured her coffee. I saw her less, but when I did, she was a shadow of herself, caught between the thrill of what she'd done and the guilt that clawed at her soul. Richard was no better. I caught him once outside the house, his face tight, his eyes haunted, like a man who'd tasted paradise and knew he'd burn for it. Ellen came back, her laughter filling the house again, oblivious to the storm that had raged in her absence. Lila and Richard moved around her like ghosts, their touches careful, their smiles forced. But I saw it, the way their eyes met across the room, the way their fingers brushed when they passed each other like they couldn't help themselves. It was a secret too big to hold, a fire too hot to contain. I wanted to tell Ellen to shatter the lie, but I didn't. I was complicit, bound by what I'd seen, what I hadn't stopped. One night I went to the house uninvited. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine, the moon low and heavy, casting shadows that danced like lovers. Lila was in the garden, her dress white and sheer, clinging to her like a second skin. Richard was there too, his shirt open, his chest rising and falling too fast. They didn't see me, didn't know I was there, hidden in the shadows of the porch. The air between them was alive, pulsing with the same heat I'd felt that first night, but now it was sharper, more desperate, like they knew the end was coming. "Lila," he said, his voice low, raw, like a man pleading for salvation. She turned to him, her eyes wide, her lips parted, and I saw the war in her, the want, the shame, the need that burned hotter than both. "We can't keep doing this," he said. But his hand was already on her, his fingers tracing the curve of her neck, sliding down to her shoulder. She shivered, her body leaning into his touch, her breath shallow. "Then why don't you stop?" she whispered, her voice a challenge, a dare. He didn't answer, just pulled her closer, his hands gripping her waist, his lips brushing her throat. She gasped, her fingers tangling in his hair, her body arching against his. The moonlight painted them in silver, their shadows merging into one. It was beautiful and terrible, a dance of desire and destruction. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I was trapped, a witness to their sin, their surrender. His hand slid lower, pulling her dress up, exposing the curve of her thigh, the soft skin glowing in the moonlight. Her breath was ragged, her moans soft and desperate, like she was drowning in him. The night seemed to hold its breath, the world narrowing to the two of them, their bodies pressed together, their desire a living thing. "Richard," she whispered, her voice breaking, and he answered with a kiss, deep and hungry, like he was trying to consume her. I saw the way her body responded, the way her hands clutched at him, the way her eyes closed, as if she could block out the world. But the world was there, waiting, ready to judge. I left before it went further, my steps silent, my heart pounding. I didn't want to see the end, but I knew it was coming. Lila and Richard caught in a web they'd spun themselves, bound by desire and doomed by it. The house loomed behind me, its windows dark, its secrets heavier than ever. I drove away, the night swallowing me, but I couldn't escape the image of them, their bodies tangled, their breaths, mingling, their sin burning brighter than the moon. So here I am, telling you this story, my voice shaking with the weight of it. I saw it all and I did nothing. Maybe that's my sin too. If this hit you hard, if it stirred something and you hit that like button, share it with someone who gets it and subscribe for more stories that cut deep. Leave a comment. Tell me what you'd have done, or don't just let it simmer. Check out the next video because trust me, the shadows have more to say. Until then, keep watching, keep feeling, and don't look away.